Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away
46, 56 degrees.
I just want to talk very briefly, and then I'll open this up for discussion. I am a social psychologist by training, and one of the things that, really social psychology is the study of how individuals are influenced by other people. So one of the things that we are interested in understanding is how we make sense of other people's behaviors. So I want to pose this question to you. What do you think about this guy right here? Well, his real name is David Eshelman. He's now a mortgage broker. But what did you think about him?
He's a what?
He's a mortgage broker. And he was a theater student at some point, too. You could probably see some hints of that. Seems pretty sadistic. So there's one characteristic there.
He seemed to enjoy what he was doing. He really got into character.
He really got into character. Like that, right. Yeah, so sadistic. What else?
I was about to say, I think he created a character and he really took on that character. Mm-hmm. He thought about his thoughts, his feelings in every way. And at some point he kind of was able to justify how he acted because it wasn't him. It was an experiment. He had an experiment inside of what they were doing.
Right, you very clearly heard him saying that afterward when he was trying to make sense of what he was doing, that I was just playing this role and I was doing my own little experiment within the experiment. Yeah.
But I think he enjoyed it.
Oh, boy.
Even at the exit interview, he was smiling, thinking back on it. So I think that even if he was playing a role, this was something that he found interesting.
He got into it. I've seen interviews with him where 20 years after the fact, where he talks about how much fun it was to just sort of play with these boys. He saw it as kind of like they were his little animals that he would play with. Yeah.
I think he was a really important role for the other security guards because inside his mind, he had justified his behavior, but the other security guards who caught on to his behavior weren't playing the same experiment in their mind. Mm-hmm. They just thought that this behavior was okay and kind of took his power trip as their own as well.
What do you think it would have happened without this guy?
I think somebody else would have stepped in.
You think so?
The same thing. I worked in a residential facility for boys. I had 16 boys that I was a house mother to. Now they fired me for reporting human rights violations.
Oh wow!
But
wow,
I had studied this experiment before I went in, and I also had training just before being hired there as a court-appointed special advocate. So I had a very different viewpoint. But most of the people who worked there were about this age. Mm-hmm. Most of them had considerably less education than you had.
Than these people. So you can, and they weren't carefully selected based on being psychologically sound.
You got in. There were people there who had criminal records themselves.
Right.
They were the most effective at getting the boys to do what they wanted because they knew the system.
Right.
And these were not kids who were in there because they were being punished. They were supposedly in there because there was nowhere else for them to go.
Right. So you think someone else would have easily filled this role? Now Zimbardo himself has been known to say that he thinks maybe it would have turned out to be the boring experiment he expected had it not been for this guy who kind of everyone followed. It's not
permission. I mean, he kind of egged them on.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody steps over the line and somebody else steps over the line, and if nobody does anything about it, I mean, everybody in this place I work got the same training going in, okay? I got there, got on an actual cottage out of training, and the first person I encountered was veteran staff who showed me, first thing she said to me is, that corner and that corner are where the cameras don't show. Wow. I said, why do I need to know that? She goes, just in case.
Wow. Yeah.
So the training you get and the actual culture there are different.
Yeah.
After I reported her for violating kids' rights, they moved me to another cottage. There was a kid there, mouthed off. I just ignored it. That's what you do. He said, okay, go to bed. The girl I was working with, the first thing she said to me was, you should have slammed her.
Wow. Yeah, so there is a culture of violence in these kinds of places, and you wanted to say something too.
Well, I was just going to say, I think kind of opposite of that. I relate this very well to basic training in the military.
Yeah, totally.
And we had a drill sergeant that was everybody hated him. He was really strict. He was really hard on everybody. Just really hated being there, you could tell. And so when he was around, we were all like, oh man, this sucks, you know, straighten up, you know, do everything. And when you get around some of the other drill sergeants, it's just like, finally, you know, I can breathe. So I think if he wasn't there, they may have calmed down a little bit, not been as, not saying, I mean, you do still see a lot of that psychological impacts, but I don't think it would have been as bad.
Right, and I do think that would, Zimbardo, if he were here, if we could channel him, he would say, this guy made it more extreme, but would this have still happened? Absolutely, right? So Mick, for example, said, when I said, what is this guy like? He's sadistic. So when we're explaining other people's behaviors, we can explain them in two ways. We can explain them in terms of the behavior comes from within the person. It's a dispositional cause. It's an internal cause, or it's an external cause. It's the situation. And so when we're saying he's a sadistic guy, what are we saying?
That's internal.
It's internal.
But it's the context allows it to happen.
Maybe perhaps brings it out in some sort of way.
Gives them some license of freedom,
right.
or it's okay to do this.
Right, but it definitely it's the situation that brings it out. Now, my husband is a philosopher. He teaches philosophy at Drury, and he's a virtue ethicist, so he's in the business of studying how we develop characters and virtues that then influence our behavior. But I'm a social psychologist, and we kind of study the opposite. How is it that the situation influences despite those characteristics that we've developed and virtues that we've developed? And that's kind of the take-home message that Zimbardo posits with all of this work. Here's a quote from him. I like it a lot. If you put good apples in a bad situation, you'll get bad apples. So he's suggesting David Eshelman was not a bad apple to start with. It was that bad situation that brought it out in him, that created it. Yeah?
They told him things, though. I mean, the things that they told the guards, I mean, you saw that light go on in his head when they were telling him, you know, you're the boss man, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you can do whatever. Go take control. I mean, they influenced.
And yeah, so you're saying that it wasn't just in a
he wasn't just solely the creator of the ideas. He was given permission by the leaders of the experiment.
And they created that situation
with
that
no
he's in.
parameters, just take control, man.
And that's exactly what they told him. Do what you want to do. Yeah.
And I'm kind of curious what he defines as a good apple.
I think how he would define that is an ordinary person. As determined by those tests that he gave at the beginning, you know, a person who is not, but that's a good question too. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a thought that maybe like, even going beyond that, maybe he had been bullied, maybe even as a child, and was given this power then to like maybe, I don't know.
Yeah. Who knows? Yeah. And we could go through each of these, but what's really interesting, I mean, him aside, he was a standout, right? But how are they put into these two groups? And we saw very different behaviors in the sadistic guards versus the very passive at the end prisoners. How are they put into those groups?
Coin flip.
Coin flip. It was completely random, wasn't it? But you saw very different behaviors come out, and it was just based on this kind of arbitrary decision or arbitrary assignment to one group versus the other. So if it is the situation that's bringing out these behaviors, what is it about that situation? I want to read you a quote from one of the prisoners. This is prisoner 416. He's the one they brought in as kind of the replacement who spent so much time in the hole with his little sausages, right? I began to feel that, and this was just a few months after the study, I began to feel that I was losing my identity, that the person that I call Clay, the person who put me in this place, the person who volunteered to go to this prison because it was a prison to me, it still is a prison to me. I began to feel that identity, the person that I had decided to go to prison, was distinct from me, was remote until finally I wasn't that. I was 416. I was really my number. What happened to him?
He was institutionalized.
He was institutionalized and he lost what?
His identity.
He was dehumanized and he lost his entire sense of identity. So one of the things we know that happens in group situations is what's called de-individuation, right? So it's when we have a sense of lost self-awareness. Self-awareness is just that self-consciousness. You know who you are. And when we're in a heightened sense of self-awareness, we're much more likely to act in line with our values and our attitudes. But if we lose that, all bets are off. So we've lost that. We've lost evaluation apprehension. What does that mean? We don't care what anybody thinks about us. I'm not being evaluated as Christie Cathey. I'm now being evaluated as prisoner 416 or the guard. Did the guards wear name tags? Did you notice? They didn't have their name associated with them. They were just guards, right? What's that? Mr. Correctional Officer, sir. In situations that foster responsiveness to group norms. So what is it? We're losing our sense of identity. We're no longer focused on who we are. We don't feel this evaluation apprehension, and we have these group norms. This is the group I'm in, and this is what's expected of me, and then we fall in line with those. How do they de-individualize these people and de-individualize these people? Yeah.
Uniforms.
Uniforms is the big deal. Yeah, back there.
One of the biggest things I noticed was how they would always put words in their mouth. You know, they told them what to say about themselves. And I think just the psychology of saying something about yourself to yourself over and over will start to change that self-image.
That's a really interesting point. And we do know that just behaving, force somebody to behave in a particular way, and their attitudes will follow. So force words into their mouth, will their attitudes follow? Yeah.
I was going to say it's the same thing like they do at basic training. Shave your head, shave your face.
Exactly.
Same uniform.
Everybody looks alike,
exactly,
right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Everybody's doing the exact same things. You're all eating together. You're all training together. You're all sleeping together. Everything is you guys together.
Everything is uniform.
Uniform, and you guys are looking the exact same.
And the upside of that is we take care of each other. Now we're a group, we have a sense of belonging, but the downside is I don't know who I am anymore, right? And so here, we have numbers instead of names, obviously. We have these ridiculous uniforms in both cases, right? But both of those led to that sense of de-individuation. Yeah.
We also have that cell group, I forget what, that didn't, right, the other two groups were rebelling. And then that one group was the quote model prisoners, so they didn't join the group. I don't know if that's because it's early in the experiment and then they didn't.
And that was
you want anything?
You are talking about the ones who were the model prisoners who didn't.
The rooms were like openly rebelling, and those that group didn't.
But by the end, they all kind of. That was early on in it. Yeah, things kind of fell apart closer to the end, though. Yeah.
They also put them on a schedule, and a lot of times when you're on a schedule, you don't need to think about anything that you're doing because people are telling you what to do. So you don't have to think about things, you don't have to make decisions, you know what you're doing.
Right. That's exactly right. So it's very regimented.
I just have a question about the time place that this experiment took place. I mean, it's the early 70s. So you saw the police beat people up, they hosed them down, they took them away, you protested, you spoke up, you got hauled away. I mean, things like this happen today, holy crap, social media would be all over it. Like, that wouldn't happen.
Social media. So this experiment in a million years could never happen now. Is that what you're saying? Just that.
In today's day and age,
right.
Extremely different experiment.
Right. Just in terms of the way the individuals would behave and respond,
and because the cultural influence that these college students grew up with.
You know, I always hear that from my students. Like, we talk about the Milgram experiment, where the Milgram experiment when people give electrical shocks, and people always say that would never happen now. We have a very different way of thinking about authority. These kinds of things wouldn't happen anymore. But in 2009, another experimenter tried to recreate the Milgram experiment. Went as far as he could go with the ethical guidelines, but what he found in that study was, and what he was able to, suggest from those findings is that he would have found very, very similar results now. And I think one of the things we like to say is, no, because it was a different time. We're not capable of those kinds of things.
Oh, I'm not saying that.
Yeah. You just think you would see different responses in those kind of situations, yeah. But and we will talk about the fact that we can't do this experiment anymore for other sorts of reasons. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about some other kinds of things that are going on. Now, they were assigned to these roles. Were they equal roles? No. One of the groups had considerable power, whereas the others, and privileges, right? So it was an asymmetric relationship they had for sure. And last night, I had one of the greatest privileges of my life. Did anybody get to go see Jane Elliot speak at MSU? It was the most fantastic thing. If you're not familiar with Jane Elliot's study she was a third grade school teacher in Riceville, Iowa, when Martin Luther King Jr. was shot. And she wanted her kids, who were all white, to understand racism and prejudice. And so what she did is she went to school the next day And she told the kids, you know, blue-eyed kids are smarter, they're better, they're going to have longer recess and these kinds of things. And she put a little collar around the brown-eyed kid's neck and just let them go to see what would happen. Very similar. Like, let's just assign one group here, and see what happens. And what happened?
The blue-eyed kids started bumping on
The blue-eyed kids were nasty, mean people. Here's a quote from her. I watched what had been marvelous, cooperative, wonderful, thoughtful children turn into nasty, vicious, discriminating little third graders in the space of 15 minutes. And if you've ever seen the film, they really did. And then what did she do the next day? She switched it, and you saw the exact same thing happen again. So what's really incredible and what struck me last night hearing her talk and watching her film again is that that's what happened here, and how quickly does it happen? Very, very quickly. Just assigning these groups. And if you elevate one, give one power, then oh my goodness, it really gets out of control. Yeah.
I wonder how they all would have acted if instead of being told, oh, we selected you to be a guard because you were like this, but straight told, oh...
It was random assignment?
Yes, just because it was a coin flip. If they would have acted differently, that, oh, we're just...
What do y'all think? Would it have made a difference? Because I was wondering the same question. I don't think it would have made a difference. Yeah, I think so. And here's one of the reasons I think this. So they do what are called minimal group experiments, where they say, oh, how many dots does this little picture have? And you estimate the number of dots. Oh, you're an overestimator. You're in this group. You're an underestimator. You're in this group. Is that a meaningful distinction? Absolutely not. So it's a minimal group. They put you in these groups, and guess what? People are really nasty to each other. They want to categorize, they want to make a difference between the two groups, and they want their group to be here, even if it's based on a stupid, how many dots do you think are in the picture? So I really think that if they had even said, hey, you're a guard because we randomly assigned you to be here, I think you would have seen the exact same thing. Yeah?
One of the things you asked early on, what surprised us based on our preconceptions coming in, the thing that surprised me was the absolute control they gave to the guard. Early on, he said, you guys are in control. Mm-hmm. You have all the power. Is that really how it works in prisons? Do guards really have that much control?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm 90%.
And I would, so people are saying
Guards
yes.
are still stripped naked, especially people of color. They're drugged through, I mean, it is, yeah. Mm-hmm. Watch 13th, the documentary.
What is it called? I've not seen this. Okay.
I worked corrections. And we have all sorts of stipulations, and all sorts of rules and guidelines that we have to go by.
I mean, that's what I was saying.
So it is not just a free-for-all. Absolutely not.
And they did have, you can't hit the other person, so they did have things in their contract.
He didn't make permission, and he never corrected them. And whenever I was working, if I did anything out of line, I would have been corrected.
From your superior,
and that would have changed everything.
A superior would have done
it?
Or
Absolutely.
a
superior. So that would be like Zimbardo.
Right.
How many of those guards rat on each other?
No, you don't even have to be rat on. We have cameras everywhere. We're being watched all the time.
Right. And, well, so we have the role of power. What about the power of roles? What kind of roles do we play in our everyday life? Tons. Teacher, student, parent, child, where do you work? Those are all roles that you play. So again, I think this illustrates the power of playing a role and how it then influences how our attitudes and our resulting behavior. So I always tell students, gosh, be really careful about the career you choose because that's a big chunk of every day of your life and you're playing a role. And is that role the type of person you want to become? Can you think of any roles that would maybe be kind of questionable in terms of the type of person you want to eventually be? We can think about that. So we might not want to talk about that out loud. And just some quick critiques of the study. So first of all, was this a methodologically sound study? Now, I told you at the beginning, what do you think is the one scene that Zimbardo wanted yanked from the film? You want to guess what that is? Yeah.
I had two.
Okay, what are your guesses?
One where his girlfriend called him out, where she said it was his prison, and he didn't really get it.
Yeah, it wasn't that.
Okay, and then,
but that's a good guess. We got another guess right there. Yeah.
Is it the one where
No, that's okay. Go.
The teacher like comes up to him and is like, "What's your independent variable?"
That's exactly it. That's what other people are going to guess too. Yes, that's exactly right. It was a colleague of his who met him in the hallway, and Zimbardo did not like that because he thought that he was portrayed as not really knowing what he was doing. But he didn't have an answer to it. We know that to be a true experiment, we have to have an isolated independent variable that we're manipulating to see how different levels of that independent variable affects the dependent variable. So we can show true causation. What was the independent variable? What was being manipulated there? There wasn't one, was there? Huh?
He just let him go.
He just let them go. It was really just a simulation, like they said. And the other thing that's been questioned a lot is just recently, in 2009-ish, there was another study that questioned whether these people were really just normal, everyday college students. They put out ads for participants, and they had it worded just the same way, but they either had the word prison study in it or took it out. Does that make sense? Guess what type of people were more likely to sign up for a study on prison life? People who were high in aggressiveness, people who were high in Machiavellianism, people who were low in empathy, low in altruism, so high in all kinds of negative qualities, low in all kinds of positive qualities. So I guess the question is, maybe there was a particular type of sample of students who were likely to sign up for the study. Yeah?
Well, involving yourself in your own sociological study, doesn't that skew the results?
You think?
Low on sleep and not probably eating correctly.
And that's one of the biggest ethical critiques of this study, is that Philip Zimbardo should have been this, objective observer in some sort of way. Was he? He played a role too. He became the prison superintendent, and didn't you see him lose his sense of who he was too? He put the glasses on. That's exactly right. That was one of the biggest problems with the study, yeah.
I think there's also something said with everyone wanted the pay out of it. We've all been in college where you have, a cabinet full of ramen noodles and a package of Kool-Aid. Like, it sounded great, and in that situation you would do anything, and you're just going to get through it, and then it all clicks.
And that's right. So that's what got them in initially. And I don't know how that was written for them, if they could, because they were told you can quit at any time. It's like they forgot to quit. I don't know if it was written that they would still get all their money, or if probably that it would be by the day. By the way, I looked it up the other day. It was about $95 a day if this were modern day money. So it was a lot of money. Yeah.
Can you talk about this notion of simulation? Is that just not really have any credibility in your field?
This was never published in a peer-reviewed journal, for example.
I guess my point is, you could say if you're trying to isolate and figure out exactly what's going on and get a single kind of cause, then that's maybe what you need to do. You want an independent variable. But a simulation says, well, if I set up these conditions,
what's going to happen?
And so they might not know exactly, but they got really
interesting. Absolutely.
And we're pretty sure that if we ran it again, we'd probably get very similar results.
That's right. That's right.
There's a phenomenon there.
Oh, absolutely.
We might not be able to disentangle exactly what's going on, but we saw some interesting.
Would people in my field look down on that kind of study? Absolutely.
Is it?
Right, and it's still, there is a guy named Peter Gray who has an intro psych textbook. He's written a bunch of stuff about why he does not include the study in his textbook, because he thinks it's garbage for a number of reasons. And one of the reasons is he really makes a big deal about this demand characteristics. That's just a fancy term for cues in the experiment that tells people how they should be behaving. And one of his big critiques is these were not just people kind of in a real kind of situation. They knew, I'm supposed to act in this way. Right, and he even suggested that they were given more coaching than this lets on. So that's one of the other big critiques of it. And then finally, is it ethical? That's one of the main reasons this is now a really famous experiment, also a really controversial experiment. One of the deals was, were these people fully informed? Right, and because one reason is they couldn't have been. Phil Zimbardo had no idea what was going to happen. So we couldn't say, yeah, and then you're going to be stripped naked, and you're going to have to pretend like you're a camel. They're not going to be told these kinds of things because they had no clue to what extent it was going to all just fall apart. So they were not fully informed. They were not even told they were going to be picked up by the Palo Alto police, because that came at the last minute, and then, so big surprise there. were they protected from psychological harm? Absolutely not. As a result of this experiment and several others, we now have really strict ethical standards that are set up by the American Psychological Association. You have to have a internal review board. So you people who are MSU students, if you're participating in research, you ain't gonna be doing this. You're safe from that, yes.
So several times in the study, in the exit interviews,
Yeah.
they stated that there were studies to show that there was no harm
Yes.
to the individual when they're
Ah.
But how could there be no psychologically lasting harm when it was a mental experiment that
Right.
broke down their identity?
Right, it's hard for me to believe too. So they did these interviews showing there was no lasting harm. Prisoner 8612, he's the first one who was released. You know what he does for a living? He's a psychologist working in a prison setting. So maybe low lasting harm, but did it influence the way his life went? I would say yes, right? So I always question that too. I think they left with this knowledge that this is what I'm capable of. And that's going to stay with you, right? Yeah.
I mean, one of the guards, they never really said much about him, but he was always off to the side, upset, didn't like what was going on.
Yeah.
Didn't anticipate. Like, is there any information on that particular kind of a character? But he kept quiet, but...
Right, they didn't follow him very much, but you could tell he was really bothered by it. One of the things I did want to point out is we notice these individual differences. Some people behave like this, some people are a little bit different. They did a battery of psychological tests, individual differences, personality measures, and they only found that authoritarianism, that's the one measure that they found was predictive of anything, and it was only predictive of the prisoner's behavior. Prisoners who were high in authoritarianism kind of dealt with the situation a little bit better. Those who think, oh yeah, this is the way things should be, so people should be here or here. Yeah.
With the psychological harm, what was the role of having the priest come in? And that just seemed like it was psychological harm.
That was weird, wasn't it? What do you think? What was the purpose of bringing in that priest? And he was a real priest, but he was pretending to be playing his priestly role. Yeah.
It's something that I guess within a normal prison setting would be done, not with necessarily a priest, but you would bring the prisoners in and talk to them and ask them what they're doing to get out, but it kind of just confused them because they seemed they knew it was a simulation, but at the same time were doubting that they even could get out because they've got a warped sense of time, they don't really know what's going on, and they've seen, at this point, one person completely lose it and he left, but they didn't tell them that he got out of the experiment. They told them that he went somewhere else. So I feel like it was to make it more real as a world for them, but at this point their sense of reality
was already gone, right? I think that's probably right. It was just to add to that, just like the parole board
They would have a chaplain,
was to.
wouldn't they, in a prison?
I suppose so. So it was just to add to the reality of that. I want to be very mindful of your time because I know it's late, but I have a 3-minute clip that I think is fascinating to me because it's a 20-year-old 60-minute clip, but I'm going to show you 3 minutes of it if you're willing. It shows Christina Maslach, the graduate student he left his wife for, but they're talking about that moment when she sees these guys with the bags on their heads and is like, no, this is not right. And it's interesting, just pay attention to how he describes what happened next. It's not really matching on with what happened here. And the other thing is he's asked the question about the ethics of it. So it's interesting, I think, to hear what his stance is on the ethics of this. And then finally, I think the big take-home message, which I do think has a lot of relevance in today's world. So are we willing 3 minutes? He still looks like that, by the way.
He succumbed to the cruelty of the environment. That night, Zimbardo invited one of his graduate students, Christina Maslach, to the mock prison. 5 prisoners in chains marched by Zimbardo's office with paper bags over their heads.
And so Phil came over and he said, my God, look, see this thing over here. And I looked up and I just began to feel sick to my stomach. I had this just chilling, sickening feeling of watching this. And I just turned away. I said, what's the matter? Come on, look. I mean, this is really fascinating stuff.
And then she said the classic line, I think it's terrible what you're doing to those boys. What she's saying is, you are responsible. Those are not prisoners. Those are not students. Those are not subjects. They're boys.
and I just let loose in this emotional tirade. I just lost it. I was angry, I was scared, I was in tears.
At that point, I said, we have to end it, obviously.
Is what you did to those students ethical?
Now, Leslie, that is a tough question. And it's actually one I've been grappling with for many, many years, because there's not a simple yes-no answer. That we learned a lot from doing this research. A lot of good came out of it. And there are a lot of positives. But the bottom line on the other side is boys suffered.
Zimbardo's experiment could not be done today because researchers have far more stringent rules of ethics involving human subjects. But back then, it took Zimbardo less than 6 days to show how an oppressive environment can transform people. Well-educated, sane, healthy, normal people.
Right, because we like to think that's a buffer against this. We want to think, well, third world people, those people might do it, dumb people might do it, poor people might do it, ghetto people might do it. And the answer our study says is no, we might do it, I might do it.
Nazi Germany, Cambodia, Rwanda. Can you turn an entire country into the prison environment that you created here?
Well, the sad thing is that's what we're seeing. We've seen it in Rwanda, we've seen it in Bosnia. We're simply labeling, people in authority labeling somebody as the enemy.
Professor Zimbardo did regular follow-up interviews with the students for several years. And
Thanks. Yeah, so what do you think about his response, or was it ethical?
He didn't want to answer that.
Yeah.
He's kind of saying the ends justifies the means.
Yeah, he is, isn't he? He isn't he? We have to justify our bad behavior sometimes. Yeah.
I just would like people to consider that this is something that still happens today in prison. The woman who worked at a prison, maybe it didn't happen in that particular prison. The woman who worked at a group home and was immediately told the cameras don't work in these two places. Extremely concerning. And the destabilization, just like the man was talking about the military, you know, the dress, the showering together, all these things. I mean, it's a demeaning.
Yeah, and I'm glad look, we should end on that point, because I think that's an important point, is these things happen now. These things happen in our prisons, and Zimbardo, we can say what we want to about him, but he has devoted much of his career to trying to bring out what actually happens in prisons and what happens to human beings as a result of being in that sort of oppressive environment, and then what can happen on larger in terms of intergroup relationships too. And then we'll take these two, and then we should end. Yeah.
All you have to do is Iraq, Abu Ghraib.
Exactly.
It's exactly that.
Exactly.
And you see the sexual degradation, right?
That's exactly.
I mean, those pictures are all over the place.
We saw some very similar things with Abu Ghraib, absolutely, and that connection has been made a lot. Yeah.
Out of curiosity, what do you think is comparable between this study and the study that's going on with the 60 days in prison study that's going on? I'm not sure if you're familiar with it.
I'm not familiar with this.
There's a series, I believe it's on like HBO, where they send volunteers that go into prison for 60 days, and they are attributed with a crime and a story. Some of them have changed their names out of like confidentiality, but they live in a prison system for 60 days.
Oh, interesting. I'll have to check this out.
It's the craziest thing I've ever watched.
So this is an HBO
absolutely
show, right? It sounds like it was probably inspired by the Zimbardo experiment. Yeah. Well, I want to be very mindful of your time, and so I promised I wouldn't go too long. But thank you so much for coming. Do you have anything you want to look me up at MSU if you have any questions about anything? But thank you so much for coming.